When Stellar Blade released, it had quite a bit of hype around it. It's this post-apocalyptic action game where we play as Eve, who is fighting together with the remnants of humanity to reclaim the planet. And in all of the trailers, the game looked beautiful and the combat looked extremely fun, especially with the dynamic set pieces. But it was never a guaranteed success. The game looked very ambitious, but it was also being developed by Shift Up, a studio who previously only worked on mobile gacha games, this being their first ever AAA console title. And it's also the start of a new IP, something that we, let's be honest, don't really see enough of these days. But Sony also had a lot of faith in this title, even deciding to give them the budget to make it a AAA game, and they also published it, making it a PS5 exclusive. Another thing that we don't really see enough of these days. And the game even got a recommendation from one of my favorite people in the industry, Yoko Taro, the creator behind the NieR franchise, which this game does take a lot of inspiration from. So with all of this excitement around it, but also with the lingering thoughts of will they be able to pull it off, I picked up the game, played through it, and now I'm here to talk about my experience with it, from a gameplay perspective, but also specifically highlighting the exploration gameplay and the narrative, as I feel like people don't really talk about those aspects when discussing Stellar Blade. Because the exploration was honestly one of my favorite parts of this game. Like, yeah, the combat is extremely fun and satisfying, but it's the context and this world around it that elevated it for me. That feeling of exploring this world, finding an interesting looking corner of a city and then finding out that you can climb on top of one of these buildings, doing a little parkour section to get there and then finding a boss at the top. It's the way that you interact with this world which then funnels you into an encounter that I really enjoyed. The game is divided into multiple open areas, or open worlds, that you unlock throughout the story, but while all of the areas are open for exploration, there is some difference in how they're structured. Some of them are more linear, but not in a restrictive way. There are a lot of different ways to go, a lot of different things to find, but it's all a winding path that interconnects with itself. It's filled with shortcuts, and there's always a clear path to progression, even if I usually avoided this path as I was too busy exploring every corner of every street. The story introduces and explores these areas in a linear way, but since there is so much to find here outside of this main path, you can return to these locations at any time. And when doing side content, they're just a great way to shake up the gameplay loop, since the other type of areas are more open and are kinda structured like a traditional open world. These are large open spaces filled with points of interest to explore, and since these are so much more open and so much bigger, you also have access to a world map here, in contrast to the more linear areas where you don't have a map, and there you're more reliant on your environment to navigate yourself. I honestly really like this though, because you can explore these linear places no problem without a map. They're a lot smaller, and by relying on your environment and the landmarks, such as your campsites, you kinda start to map these places out in your mind. These landmarks are of course still present in the more open locations, and they can help you with the general navigation, but since these are just so much bigger, the map does help you when you're tracking your quests or your objectives. But even if I'm saying that these areas are big, they're not big in an overwhelming sense. They're very manageable to explore, they're densely packed with content, and there is a lot of verticality going on. The world also makes perfect use of its environments to guide you through it or to point you towards something interesting in a natural way. Most of this open world content, to say it like that, also isn't marked on your map. It's not a checklist and it's not cluttered with markers, which is one of my favorite parts of the exploration. It all feels extremely organic and natural. It's a world that feels very handcrafted, and it's filled with detail that rewards player exploration. Sometimes you'll just be walking in an urban environment only to notice climbable ledges at the top, which then makes you explore this area to find the way up. And at other times you'll run into an environmental puzzle, or a combat challenge, or even a random boss fight. And all of these things will earn you some worthwhile rewards, from health upgrades or combat upgrades, to outfits or even bits of lore and story, as the game does a lot of its narrative world building through the exploration gameplay. By finding notes or abandoned camps, the game is making you familiar with the events that took place on this world, while also foreshadowing during future plot points. I'll touch on the world building some more later though when I talk about the story, but just keep this in mind for now. But outside of the explorable, open and linear areas, there's also one other place that you can go, the city of Zion, aka your hub. On the outskirts of the city, you have your camp with Adam and Lily, your two companions. Here you can view your collectibles, craft upgrades, you know, the usual stuff. And the city itself then is where you can visit shops and get your side quests. The quests coming from NPCs and shopkeepers are more often than not pretty damn good, by the way, and I definitely recommend you do them. Zion plays a pretty big role in the story, and these side quests are basically there to connect you more to the city and the people living here. And as a side note, every shopkeeper NPC also has an affinity level that goes up by doing their quests or by buying the items that they're selling. And this makes for a very dynamic system that also makes the world feel more real and more impacted by your actions, as these shops will start selling you new items or outfits, but they will also tell you more about themselves, which then unlocks new side quests in return. Sometimes doing a random NPC quest can also do things like opening up new shops in the city, like the hairstylist, so you can customize Eve even more. And talking about the customization, by the way, the game goes kind of insane with this, as there are so many different outfits with color variations, separate accessories, and you can even change the color and the style of your hair. Months after release, they're still adding in more customization, and I think that's kind of awesome. But getting back on track, I really like this hub city. A lot of the major NPCs also have some fun personalities, some interesting stories, and unlocking stuff like this to evolve and rebuild the city really grounds your connection that you have with this world. However, you can also get side quests from the quest board, and most of these are just fetch quests. Some of them are kinda cool, like the puzzle or the riddle ones, but in general, the only purpose that these fetch quests serve is that they give you objectives out in the world, often leading you to places that you otherwise might have ignored. And while that is cool, and while they do serve the game in that way, I think there are too many of these, and they probably could have cut like half of them. But they do lead you to some cool locations and especially some cool combat encounters. And the combat is definitely the thing that drew most people into this game. And that is very understandable, as the combat system in this game looks really stylish, flashy, and it generally just looks really cool. And luckily, it actually does play as good as it looks. You have a lot of options, it feels really dynamic, and all of the combos flow together really nicely. You also just have a solid sense of progression, and there's a pretty big variety in both the enemies and the environments, which forces you to switch up your playstyles. The difficulty for random enemies can be a bit awkward at times though. The bosses were always a perfect level of challenge for me, but once you start unlocking your special attacks, a lot of the open world encounters just become a joke. These attacks do give you a cool animation, they do a great job at shaking up the gameplay, and it gives you more options to play with, but they can also end random encounters with one attack, which I think is a bit much. In general though, the game feels really good to play and control, especially in the boss fights, as some of these use unique mechanics that I won't spoil, but they honestly shake up the gameplay in a very fun way, and a lot of the boss fights in this game were just a joy. Also, outside of the combats, the game feels really snappy and it feels like you're in control. Like, the climbing and the platforming just feels really nice, fluid and responsive. Eve does kind of feel like she's standing on ice sometimes when you just come out of a sprint, but that's like the only criticism that I can really think of. It's just really nice that the game gives the player the control over everything. A lot of games often put you on rails when you're wall running or climbing. They stick you to the wall like it's a ladder or a railing. But here you are in control, and this gives them a lot to play around with. And even in the main missions they make use of this, as the main story often visits unique locations that aren't accessible anymore after beating that level. These story dungeons feel very unique gameplay-wise, with some of them disabling your melee weapons and others having special platforming sections, puzzle rooms, or even parts where you're blade surfing while fighting a boss. There are a lot of really cool set pieces here. And even outside of the gameplay, these unique locations are also very welcome because of the beautiful environments that they bring with them. The environments and the vibes in this game are just immaculate, be it in the explorable areas, the boss arenas, or or in the story dungeons. The music always fits perfectly and it sets the tone. The game is really nice to look at graphically on a technical level, but of course visual fidelity isn't everything, and it's also the environmental art design that really elevates this world. There are so many breathtaking locations, and this game just has some moments that made me slow down to a standstill, to take in the atmosphere, listen to the music, and look at all of the visual detail. And that's only mentioning the environmental designs. I can't show too much for spoiler reasons, but with some creature and some boss designs, you can see that the designers went all out. But now that we're on the topic of these unique story locations, let's actually talk about the narrative itself, because this is something that not a lot of people talk about when talking about Stellar Blade. And I can kinda see why, as the developers even said that this wasn't their main focus when developing the game. Instead, they wanted to really nail down on the gameplay in this world. But that doesn't mean that the story isn't worth mentioning, and that definitely doesn't mean that there isn't a narrative here. The pacing is a little strange though. I remember being in a Discord chat with some friends, and around 8 to 9 hours into the game, they would ask me what my thoughts were on the story. But I couldn't really answer that question. Partly because I was doing every bit of content that I could find, so I was going at a pretty slow pace, but also because this game really takes its time before the story actually kicks off. Like, yeah, you get introduced to the main cast and there are some cool moments in the opening, which I really enjoyed, but for the first half, basically, you'll mostly just be doing busy work to help out Scion. I said earlier that this game has a lot of side quests, and you'll be doing most of them during this early section, because during this, the game is extremely focused on its world building. And to its credit, they did build a really interesting universe here, in my opinion. The game might not be that story-focused, especially in these early parts, but there is some really interesting lore for you to find. As you're exploring this world, you learn about the AI Mother Sphere. You learn about humanity and the colony where Eve is from. The game is telling you the story of this universe purely through the gameplay experience and the environment. Technically, you can skip over a lot of this content if you're just beelining the main story, but the way that the game is structured, and just because of the pure vibes, you'll be doing a lot of this naturally. Many of the side quests are also placed on your way to the main objective, so you'd have to be actively avoiding it to not engage with it. But I highly recommend that you do this content though, not only because it's a big part of the storytelling, but also because one of the main characters, Lily, has a hidden progress bar. This bar will show up on your screen every now and then, and you can progress it by completing subquests or picking up collectibles. This is because your relationship with Lily, which the bar represents, grows stronger as you're helping out more people. And if you can get her bar to above 80% by a certain point of the story, you will unlock a whole new area to explore. You unlock a special story event, and that is extremely important because it will also give you access to the true ending. This story event is also one of my favorite parts of the game, by the way, as it really highlights our main cast. As I said, the story is very much in the background for a big portion of this game, so having this section with the main characters was really nice. I honestly don't know why it's optional, as the game could have used more scenes like this. I guess there is the in-game explanation of if you're not doing side content, Eve won't be growing closer to Lily that much, and because of that she won't open up to you. But this is kind of a big weak point of the story. The world building is solid, but all actual character and narrative work is kept for the later half of the game. Because of this, I also wasn't too invested in the narrative of Eve or any of the other characters. I was really enjoying my time with the game, but I was hooked on the gameplay and the world, not really the characters or the narrative. But it also feels like the game kind of knows this, as it's not really trying to reach any emotional peaks either. You're just exploring and helping people out. It's very much just laying a foundation. Thankfully though, the rest of the game does take advantage of this foundation, as when you progress through the story, the narrative and the characters will slowly start coming to the forefront. They slowly start revealing bits and pieces of information which will make you question everything that you think you know of this world. Because this information is only drip-fed to you though, at first I did kinda have the feeling of, oh, I I've seen this before, and I've kinda seen it done better. But as the game goes on, they flesh this out, and the story does form more onto its own, and I love the direction that it took, especially for the ending itself. The game also has multiple endings, each revealing different bits of the world, and they revealed some stuff that genuinely surprised me with how much I liked it, and without realizing it, I actually got pretty hooked on this story by the endgame. It wasn't absolutely mind-blowing, it wasn't a narrative masterpiece, but it was a pretty fun ride. The characters also aren't the deepest or the most profoundly written, but I was intrigued by some of them like Raven, and I liked the people of Zion, and I did care about Eve and Lily and the friendship that they formed. The lore of this world also really intrigued me throughout the game, so I did really enjoy seeing all of these reveals come together. But even if I was enjoying the story in the later parts, that first half is still this game's biggest weakness story-wise. Because while the story does take a bit more of a center stage later on, it could have done so even more, and it definitely could have benefited from a stronger first half. Like, yeah, the world building is great, but I feel like there were more interesting ways to go about it. And while I do like the characters, they could have been fleshed out a lot more, and they also could have used that early game to establish a stronger connection, kinda like they did with the people of Zion. Out of the main cast, I cared most about Lily because she was just a fun and charming character, and the game does give her some nice characterization while she's building her friendship with Eve, but a lot of the other characters just left me wanting more, which is a feeling that I have with a lot of things in this game. But an interesting point to make from that is that the developers have openly stated that stellarblade is just the beginning for them. I'll put the full quotes on screen right now with some articles in the description, but it really sounds like they have a long-term plan for this, with many characters and aspects possibly being expanded upon in the future. And if you think about that, it makes sense that I was left with this feeling. Of course, all of this could be marketing talk, but after playing the game, I am inclined to believe them because of this feeling. Either way, it'll be interesting to revisit stellarblade one day though and see how it turned out. And worst case scenario, if they do fail to meaningfully expand on this IP from the narrative front, this is still a really fun game regardless, so fuck it. I'm up for seeing where they're gonna take this. Because despite the flaws of this narrative, or despite the lack of a narrative in some parts of the game, I'm honestly really excited for the future of stellarblade. They got the gameplay down 100% and the sequel can only improve on it, and the story and these characters carry a lot of potential. The way that this game concludes really shows how much of this world they have planned out, how many moving pieces there are, and seeing the game slowly reveal that during the ending is the thing that really left me wanting more. While right now I do care about a few of these characters, my connection to them isn't that deep. But if we bring these characters back, they can do so much with them. They have this quote-unquote backstory now. They have this entire setup for future plot points, and I can't wait to see where they go with it. Plus, this development studio has a lot of experience in developing gacha, so that means that they're used to telling massive stories over the course of many years. And the idea of one of those stories being told in the way of AAA console titles instead of gacha mobile games does get me kind of excited. It might be weird that I'm ending my review for this game with my hopes for the future, but I feel like that's not a bad thing, especially not when talking about a new IP from a new studio. I finished this game a while ago and I still have it installed just because I'm really looking forward to returning to it every now and then. They already did some pretty big free updates, with even a NieR collab on the way, or by the time that this video is out it's probably already released. And it's just always a joy to boot up this game again and to engage with this world once more. I don't necessarily think it's a masterpiece or a game of the year, but I did really enjoy my time with it. Before release, people were often scared that this would just turn out to be a NieR clone or ripoff. The developers were proudly stating that they were heavily inspired, and yeah, there are many similarities. But the game proved everyone wrong, as stellarblade is so much more than that. For their first ever console title, Shift Up set out to create a fun and stylish action game, and in my opinion they succeeded at that. The narrative might not be that outstanding because of the slow start, but towards the end it did come together, even if the other elements are definitely still the highlight here. The gameplay is engaging all the way through, both the combat and the exploration is phenomenal, and throughout the story the game keeps introducing new mechanics to keep it fresh. The world is also just incredibly immersive thanks to the OST and the absolute vibes that it radiates. And in my opinion, all of those things make this a game worth experiencing, despite its flaws. Thank you for watching.